The road home had vanished beneath the snow, swallowed by the kind of buffalo winter that made every street feel forgotten. Sarah Miller walked fast, clutching a paper bag with 2 dinner rolls and an apple, thinking only of her children waiting in a drafty house at the edge of town. Then she saw the wrecked police SUV, half buried in ice, one headlight still blinking through the storm. A wounded officer lay beside it, bleeding into the snow, while a German shepherd stood over him like a living warning. She should have kept walking. Instead, she stepped closer, because when the officer forced his eyes open and whispered, "They're coming back," Sarah knew the night was no longer hers, and before dawn, danger would be knocking at her door hard. Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and be part of the journey. Now, let's get into it. Buffalo wore the winter-like armor, all white silence, iron wind, and streets that seemed to forget the names of the people walking them. Sarah Miller kept her head down and her shoulders tight as she crossed the last stretch of road near the old industrial blocks, where warehouses hunched in the dark like sleeping giants. She was 32, tall in the way hunger sometimes made a woman look taller, with a narrow frame wrapped in a thrift store coat that had lost its warmth 2 winters ago. Her dark brown hair, once soft and carefully kept, was now tied in a loose knot that the wind kept worrying apart. Snow clung to the stray strands around her face and melted against skin so pale it seemed almost blue under the streetlights. Her cheekbones were sharp, her mouth usually gentle but taught by hardship into caution, and her hazel eyes had the restless alertness of someone who had learned that peace could vanish faster than money. Before life had folded in on itself, Sarah had been a nurse, steady-handed and quietly capable. Then came the marriage that turned cruel by degrees, the fear, the running, the cheap rental house, the cleaning jobs, and the daily arithmetic of survival. Those things had not made her cold, only tired in the bones, and careful with hope. She held a paper bag under one arm as if it contained treasure. Inside were 2 dinner rolls, 1 apple with a bruise the size of her thumb, and a small carton of soup bought with the last of the cash from her cleaning shift. It was not enough. But mothers had built entire kingdoms out of not enough. Her thoughts were fixed on the children waiting at home. Ethan, her 8-year-old son, had his father's dark brows but none of his hardness. He was a thin, serious boy with chestnut hair that always fell over one eye, and a habit of listening longer than most adults spoke. He had become watchful too young, the kind of child who noticed the sound of tires outside and whether a door locked properly. Lily, only 5, still carried softness where life had not yet managed to carve itself in. She had a round face, pale gold curls that never obeyed a brush, and wide blue-gray eyes that asked questions faster than the world could answer them. She still believed dinner could taste better if her mother smiled while serving it. Thinking of them quickened Sarah's pace. The cold stung her lungs, but what frightened her more was the thought of them waiting in that drafty house with its rattling windows and thin walls, listening for her footsteps. Then she saw the light. At first, it was only an odd pulse through the snow, an unsteady glow where no light should have been. Sarah slowed. Ahead, beyond a line of half-buried guardrail, a police SUV sat twisted at an angle off the road, its front end buried in a drift and its bumper crushed against an iced-over fence. One headlight blinked weakly through the storm, on and off, as if the vehicle itself were struggling to stay conscious. The sight pulled at something deep in her chest, something older than fear, and nearly as strong as duty. She should have walked the other way. That instinct came to her at once, clean and practical. Trouble had a smell, and this smelled like it. Blood, gasoline, frozen metal. Sarah knew all 3. For 6 months she had survived by stepping around danger, by making herself smaller than the bad luck hunting her. The safest choice was simple. Keep moving, get home, feed the children, pretend she had seen nothing. Someone else would come. Someone always did. That was the lie frightened people told themselves when they needed to sleep at night. But there was no one else on the road. The wind pushed at her back as if urging her on, yet she found herself moving closer, one slow step at a time. That was when the dog appeared. It stepped out from the shadow of the open driver's door without a bark, without wasted motion, as if it had been carved from the storm itself. A German shepherd, large and powerfully built, perhaps 5 years old, with a deep black and tan coat dusted in snow and a chest broad enough to look almost leonine in the dark. Its ears were high and rigid, its muzzle long and scarred faintly near the nose, and its amber-brown eyes were the eyes of something trained to decide in a heartbeat whether a stranger lived or bled. This was no household pet. Discipline hung off it like a second skin. Yet there was intelligence there too, and grief, and a kind of relentless loyalty that made Sarah's own breath catch. The dog planted itself between her and the wreck, paws braced, shoulders squared, every muscle tight with warning. "Easy," Sarah whispered, though her own voice trembled. The growl that came back was low and controlled, more frightening for its restraint. Sarah stopped. Her hands lifted slightly, palms open, and the paper bag crinkled under her arm. Behind the dog, half in and half out of the SUV, lay a man in a dark police winter uniform. Snow had gathered on his back and along one sleeve. Blood soaked through his shoulder, black in the night. Even sprawled against the frozen road, he looked formidable. Broad, shouldered, tall, built with the dense strength of a man who trusted his body because it had saved him before. His face was cut from hard angles, with a square jaw shadowed by 2 days of dark stubble, a straight nose streaked with dried blood, and close-cropped brown hair matted at the temple. He looked to be in his late 30s, the kind of man strangers might call intimidating until they heard him speak to a child or saw him kneel beside an injured animal. Life and duty had pressed discipline into every line of him, but pain had cracked that discipline open now. His breathing was ragged. One gloved hand twitched weakly against the snow. Sarah's heart beat so hard it hurt. She thought of Ethan's quiet face, of Lily's small hands wrapped around a warm bowl, of how one wrong choice could drag ruin to her door again. She also thought of hospital corridors, of fluorescent lights, of voices saying, "We still have time." The old self she had buried beneath exhaustion stirred like a match catching flame. The officer's eyes opened a fraction, blue-gray, unfocused but alive. He looked not at Sarah first, but at the dog. His lips parted, and the words came out shredded by pain. "Rex, easy." The dog did not move, but the growl faded. Then the officer looked at Sarah, as if forcing himself to see her clearly through the snow and the dark. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Please," he whispered, each syllable thin and breaking. "They're coming back." Sarah stood frozen for one terrible second, the world narrowing to the wounded man, the vigilant dog, and the storm spinning around them like a warning from heaven. Everything sensible inside her said run. But the better part of her, the part that had once chosen care over fear, rose quietly and refused to kneel. She took one step forward. By the time Sarah got Daniel Brooks through her front door, her arms were shaking so badly she could hardly keep hold of him. He was heavier than he looked on the roadside, not because he was bulky, but because unconscious men gave nothing back to the hands trying to save them. Up close, Officer Daniel Brooks looked even more severe than he had in the snow, a man carved out of square lines and hard discipline. He was in his late 30s, broad through the chest, with the solid frame of someone who had spent years wearing body armor, lifting weight, and trusting endurance more than luck. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and there was a thin scar near his chin, the kind a man picked up in some old fight and never bothered to explain. Even half fainting, there was something restrained about him, as if pain annoyed him more than it frightened him. Sarah guessed he was the sort of officer who spoke little, watched everything, and made people feel safe or nervous depending on which side of trouble they stood. Tonight, blood had soaked through his winter uniform from the shoulder down, and the cold had turned his skin a pale gray under the entryway light. Rex came in behind them without needing to be called, stepping over the warped threshold with the silent authority of a second guard. Inside the house, the dog seemed larger than before. His black and tan coat was thick with snow around the back and neck, his muzzle long and intelligent, his amber eyes moving from room to room in quick, assessing glances. He was no younger than 5, still at full strength, but there was maturity in the way he held himself, the patience of an animal trained not only to attack, but to wait. Sarah saw at once that Rex did not belong to chaos. He belonged to command, routine, and a man who had likely been his whole world for years. The house itself looked smaller with danger inside it. It was a narrow rental on the forgotten edge of Buffalo, all cracked paint, thin walls, and old floorboards that muttered beneath every step. The kitchen light cast a weak yellow circle over the room, leaving the corners in shadow. Wind hissed through a gap near the window frame, carrying the smell of snow and old wood. Ethan appeared first, standing just beyond the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. At 8, he had the cautious stillness of a child who had learned to measure adult faces before speaking. He was thin in the way winter made poor children thin, with sharp shoulders under a faded sweatshirt and chestnut hair falling untidily over dark, thoughtful eyes. He saw the blood, saw the uniform, and his expression changed without a word. He did not panic. That, more than anything, hurt Sarah. Children were supposed to panic. Children were supposed to cry and hide. Ethan just stepped aside so she could get the wounded man to the kitchen. Lily came next, smaller and softer, clutching the edge of the doorway with one hand. At 5, she still looked like a child the world had not finished bruising, round cheeks, pale curls, a pink mouth always ready with a question. But fear had already taught her silence when something serious entered her room. She stared at Rex with wide eyes and pressed her back to the wall. "Mama?" she asked in a tiny voice. "Why is there a dog?" Sarah swallowed down the exhaustion clawing at her throat. "Because he belongs with him," she said, lowering Daniel carefully against the kitchen wall before dragging over one of the chairs to support his upper body. "And because tonight, nobody makes noise unless I say so." Ethan nodded immediately. Lily nodded because Ethan did. Daniel stirred as Sarah knelt beside him. His eyelashes lifted, his gaze drifted, blurred, then fixed on her face with visible effort. "No ambulance," he said, the words rough and frayed. "No local dispatch." He drew in a broken breath that sounded like it scraped his lungs. "They're looking for me." Sarah cut open the shoulder of his uniform with the small kitchen scissors she used for everything from thread to vegetable stems. "Who is they?" she asked. Daniel's mouth tightened. It was not the expression of a man refusing to answer out of stubbornness. It was the expression of a man who had learned answers could kill people. "Can't trust anyone yet." His eyes shifted once toward the children, then back to Sarah. "Please." That single word carried more weight than explanations would have. Sarah hated that it worked on her. She hated that the old part of her, the nurse she had buried under cleaning chemicals and unpaid rent, rose so quickly when someone needed saving. It felt unfair, like being asked to become herself again before she was ready. "Ethan," she said, and her voice came back steadier than she felt. "Hot water, clean towels, first aid box from the bathroom cabinet." He moved at once, quick and quiet, his thin legs flashing past the table. "Lily, sit on the chair by the stove and stay there." Lily obeyed, though her gaze stayed fixed on Rex as if he might suddenly decide the kitchen needed a princess for dinner. The dog, for his part, had positioned himself half a step from Daniel's boots, body angled toward everyone in the room, guarding without growling now. Sarah kept one eye on him while she worked. Up close, the wound was ugly. The bullet had gone in high through the shoulder, not clean. The torn fabric stuck to the blood. More dangerous than the sight of it was the slow, stubborn bleeding. Daniel had already lost too much. Sarah's hands hovered for the briefest second above the wound, and in that second memory hit her hard. Fluorescent hospital lights, gloved fingers, clipped instructions, a younger version of herself who had believed skill could hold the world together. Her stomach tightened. For months she had told herself that woman was gone. Yet here, in a freezing kitchen with soup still unopened on the counter and her children watching, the old instincts returned with humiliating ease. She cleaned the wound as best she could, and Daniel's jaw tightened hard enough to stand out under the stubble, but he made almost no sound. Sarah noticed that about him. He endured pain the way some men endured weather, as if complaint were wasted breath. "You can bite down on this if you want," she said, offering a folded towel. A ghost of something almost dry and amused passed over his face. "I'm fine." "Men say that right before they pass out," Sarah muttered. Ethan came back with the supplies, then took position beside her without asking where to stand. She handed him the clean cloth. "Press here when I tell you." He nodded once, too solemn for 8. Lily from the chair whispered, "Mama, are we still having dinner?" Sarah nearly laughed, nearly cried. "Yes," she said, though the soup could have frozen solid by then, and she would still have said yes. Some promises existed to keep children standing. The bullet was still in there. Sarah knew it from the angle, from the resistance under the torn muscle, from the way Daniel's breathing changed whenever she touched too near the wound. Getting it out in a kitchen was a terrible idea. Leaving it in with men possibly searching the streets was worse. She sterilized the tweezers over the stove flame, let them cool just enough, then looked once at Daniel. "You stay awake," she said. His eyes, pale and intent now despite the pain, stayed on hers. Trying. Sarah worked. Ethan pressed when she told him. Rex stood without moving, every muscle rigid as old wire. Lily squeezed her hands over her ears when Daniel finally let out one sharp breath through his teeth. Then, with a small metallic click against the bowl, the bullet came free. For a moment nobody moved. The sound was so small, yet it seemed to split the room in two, the part of their lives before it and everything after. Rex stood without moving, every muscle rigid as old wire. Lily squeezed her hands over her ears when Daniel finally let out one sharp breath through his teeth. Then, with a small metallic click against the bowl, the bullet came free. For a moment nobody moved. The sound was so small, yet it seemed to split the room in two, the part of their lives before it and everything after. The first knock came so hard it rattled the spoon in the sink. Sarah froze with her blood-stained hands still hovering above the table, every nerve in her body turning toward the door at once. Outside, the wind drove snow against the siding in furious bursts. But beneath it she heard something worse. The low idle of an engine, then the crunch of boots on ice. Daniel, half conscious in the chair, opened his eyes as if pain itself had dragged him back. The color had not returned to his face, and the wound in his shoulder still seeped through the bandage, but the policeman in him snapped awake before the man did. "Hide me," he said, voice hoarse and thin. "Now." Sarah did not waste time asking questions. She had lived too long with danger to mistake its footsteps when it arrived. She crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and crouched beside Ethan. "Take Lily to the storage closet," she whispered. "No talking, no crying, no matter what you hear." Ethan nodded once. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were steady, old in a way that made Sarah's heart ache. He took Lily's small hand. She clung to him immediately, her pale curls trembling around her cheeks, confusion bright in her wet eyes. "Mama, go," Sarah said, more sharply than she meant to, and Lily went because fear had taught her the difference between her mother's tired voice and her emergency voice. The second knock was louder, followed by a man's voice cutting through the storm. "Police, open up!" Sarah's mouth went dry. Daniel gave the faintest, ugliest little smile, the kind a man made when he had been proven right and hated it. "Not police," he muttered. Rex had already moved. The German shepherd stepped away from Daniel's side and into the space between the kitchen and front room, his body low, head forward, ears fixed. In the thin yellow light, his coat looked almost black along the spine, the snow on his back melting into dark streaks. He was all restraint now, all waiting violence. Sarah gripped the back of Daniel's chair. "Can you stand?" "For 10 seconds, he said. "Maybe." That was enough. She got her shoulder under his good arm and dragged him behind the tall pantry cabinet near the far wall, a narrow pocket of shadow that hid him from the front door unless someone came all the way inside. He bit back a groan, jaw tightening under the dark stubble, and nearly collapsed when she eased him down. Up close, his face looked carved from exhaustion, hard brow, square chin, the scar near his jaw gone white with strain. But his eyes stayed clear. "If they come in," he whispered, "get down." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity. Men were always giving women instructions while bleeding on their kitchen floors. Instead, she turned to Rex. The dog looked at her, and for one strange second, it felt like staring into the mind of another soldier. "Stay quiet," she breathed. "Please." The fact that she said please to a dog in the middle of a disaster would have been funny in a better life. She opened the door before the third knock could split the frame. 2 men stood on the porch beneath the weak porch bulb. Snow gathered on their shoulders and boots, both wearing thick, dark jackets with no badges visible. The taller one was built like a fence post, lean, long-faced, late 40s perhaps, with hollow cheeks, a gray knit cap pulled low, and a narrow mouth that seemed made for bad news. His nose had been broken once and healed crooked, and his eyes had the flat, watchful look of a man who had spent too many years making other people afraid for a living. The second man was shorter but broader, maybe mid-30s, with a shaved head under a black beanie, a thick neck, and a reddish beard cut close along a jaw that looked permanently clenched. His face was rough with old acne scars, and he carried himself with the heavy confidence of someone who liked using his size before his words. The tall one smiled first. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind used by men who considered politeness another tool for breaking locks. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Bad weather to be out alone." Sarah folded her arms over her chest, hiding the blood on her sleeves in the dim light as best she could. "That depends on who's asking." The bearded one leaned slightly, trying to see past her into the house. "We're looking for an officer who may have been in an accident nearby." His voice was gravelly, too casual by half. "Saw anything?" Sarah let silence sit between them for a beat. She knew this game. She had once lived with a man who smiled right before he lied, and these two had that same rotten patience. "I saw snow," she said. "I saw bad roads. I saw the electric bill I can't pay. That enough for you?" The tall man chuckled as if she had amused him, but his eyes never softened. "Mind if we come in and warm up while we ask a few questions?" Behind Sarah, a floorboard creaked softly. She felt rather than saw Rex adjust his weight. Her pulse climbed into her throat. "Yes," she said flatly. "I do mind." The bearded man's gaze sharpened. "You live here alone?" "No," Sarah answered. "I live here with 2 kids and bad luck. Tonight the bad luck already arrived, so you're late." That seemed to irritate him. He took one boot toward the threshold, and at once Rex slid forward out of the shadow, silent as smoke. The change in the doorway was immediate. The dog filled the space with disciplined menace, head high, shoulders braced, amber eyes pinned on the men. The bearded one stopped. "That," he said, "does not look like a pet." Sarah's stomach dropped, but her face didn't move. She bent slightly, keeping her body between them and the kitchen, and laid one hand on Rex's neck. Beneath her palm, the dog felt like drawn wire. "He's just a dog," she said. "Mostly useless unless you're a sandwich." The tall man watched Rex more carefully now. "That's a shepherd." "Congratulations," Sarah said. "You know dogs." The bearded man squinted. "Looks trained." Sarah leaned down as if to restrain an overexcited pet and whispered so softly only Rex could hear, "Play dumb, hero." It was a ridiculous instruction, the sort of thing spoken by desperate women and cartoon characters. Yet the miracle arrived on 4 paws. Rex blinked, relaxed, then did something so sudden Sarah almost forgot to breathe. He let his tongue loll out, wagged his tail with clumsy enthusiasm, and stepped forward with the eager stupidity of a suburban yard dog. He nudged the bearded man's gloved hand, then sneezed on his boot. The tall man barked a laugh. The bearded one recoiled in disgust. "Jesus, get this mutt off me." Sarah grabbed Rex's collar, though the dog was already backing away, eyes lowered in a performance so convincing it would have won awards. "Told you," she said dryly. "Sandwiches and nonsense." The moment shifted, not safely, but enough. The tall man glanced once more over her shoulder, then stepped back into the snow. "If an injured officer comes by, you call it in." "Sure," Sarah said. "Right after I call a roofer, a plumber, and the Lord himself." The bearded man pointed at her with one gloved finger. "Don't get smart." Sarah looked him square in the eye, thin and tired, and absolutely done being frightened for free. "Then don't come knocking past midnight in a blizzard." For a second she thought he might force his way in anyway. Then the tall one touched his arm. "Leave it." The 2 men turned and headed back toward a dark SUV at the curb, their shapes blurring in the snow. Sarah waited until the doors slammed and the headlights rolled away before she shut her own door. Only then did her knees weaken. She leaned against the wood, breathing hard, while behind her the house stayed silent, except for Lily's muffled sob from the closet and Daniel's ragged breath behind the pantry. Sarah closed her eyes for one moment and understood, with the cold certainty of a storm settling over a city, that the men were gone for now, but the night had not finished with them. For a long moment after the SUV disappeared into the storm, no one in the house moved. Sarah stood with her back against the door, one hand still on the latch, her lungs dragging in cold, shallow breaths that never seemed to reach the bottom. The silence felt thinner now, stretched over danger like glass over black water. From the storage closet came the faint rustle of children trying not to cry. Behind the pantry, Daniel Brooks let out a low, involuntary breath that sounded like pain waking up again. Rex was the first to move. The German Shepherd crossed the kitchen in 3 silent steps and pressed his muzzle once against Daniel's knee, not whining, not panicking, simply checking that his person was still there. Then he turned those intelligent amber eyes towards Sarah, as if he were passing her the next decision. Sarah pushed away from the door and forced herself to become practical again. Fear could scream later. For now, there was blood on the floor, a wounded man in her kitchen, and 2 children who needed her voice to sound like the world still obeyed rules. "Ethan, you can come out," she called softly. The closet door opened a crack, then wider. Ethan stepped out first, slight and pale, his chin lifted too high in the way children did when they were trying to look brave for their mothers. Lily stumbled after him, cheeks damp, curls flattened on one side from pressing against the wall. She ran to Sarah and wrapped both arms around her waist. Sarah held her for 1 second, no more, because the room still needed her hands. Daniel's fingers were clumsy when he tried to reach inside his coat. Sarah crouched beside him and gently moved his hand away. "Stop," she said. "You're making it worse." He looked up at her through the haze of pain, his face gray under the stubble, blue-gray eyes still clear in that stubborn way of his. "Inside pocket," he said. "Badge case." Sarah hesitated only a moment before slipping her hand into the inner lining of his coat. What she found was not the ordinary police badge she had expected. It was heavier, black leather folded around a metal shield, and an identification card marked with a special internal task force designation. Tucked behind it was a small laminated card with a number written in neat block print and one line beneath it. "If compromised, call immediately." Sarah felt the kitchen tilt slightly beneath her. Daniel watched her face and gave the faintest nod. "Use that." "Who are you?" she asked before she could stop herself. A tired shadow of humor touched his mouth. "Tonight?" "A man having a very bad evening." She almost smiled, which felt insulting to the situation, and instead she reached for the phone mounted on the kitchen wall. Her fingers shook only once while dialing. The line picked up on the second ring. A woman's voice answered, low and controlled, the kind that did not waste words because it expected to be obeyed. "Go." Sarah blinked. "I found a man, Officer Daniel Brooks. He's been shot." Silence followed, but not confusion calculation. "Describe him." Sarah did. The voice sharpened immediately. "Is he conscious?" "Barely." "Is the K9 with him?" Sarah looked at Rex, who stood with the patience of a sentry carved in fur and bone. "Yes." Another pause, shorter this time. "Good. Listen carefully. Do not call local law enforcement. Do not open the door for anyone. We are en route." "Who is this?" Sarah asked. "Deputy Director Mara Keene," the woman said. "Federal oversight." Then, as if sensing panic moving under Sarah's skin, her tone changed by 1 degree and became almost human. "You did the right thing." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the receiver for a second before hanging it up. Daniel's eyes had closed again, but when she knelt beside him, he spoke without opening them. "Told you. Couldn't trust local dispatch." "Federal oversight?" Sarah said quietly. "What does that even mean?" Daniel forced his head back against the cabinet and swallowed. "It means some of the wrong people wear the right uniforms." The word settled over the kitchen colder than the wind outside. He gave her pieces after that, not because he wanted to, but because exhaustion had loosened the lock on caution. Daniel Brooks was not just a patrol officer. For nearly a year he had been attached to a sealed internal investigation, tracking missing evidence, falsified reports, and weapons that had somehow traveled from police storage to criminal hands. Men inside departments, men outside them, money moving through respectable offices with dirty fingers on the paperwork. Daniel had seen enough to make himself dangerous, and sometime that evening, someone had decided dangerous men should stop breathing. Sarah listened without interrupting, the old bitterness rising in her chest. It was always the same story wearing a different coat. Men building power, then using it like a crowbar against anyone smaller. Her eyes drifted to Ethan and Lily, now sitting side by side at the table with the unopened soup between them like a guest nobody liked. She thought of how often she had told herself that if she kept her head low enough, cruelty might pass over them. But cruelty had a talent for knocking anyway. The team arrived 23 minutes later, though the storm made it feel longer. Their vehicles came without sirens, dark and purposeful, headlights cutting white bars through the snow. The knock on the door was firm, measured, and somehow more frightening for its professionalism. When Sarah opened it, 3 figures stood on the porch in weather-dark tactical coats. The woman in front was Mara Keene. She looked to be in her mid-40s, tall and spare, with bronze-brown skin, a long angular face, and dark hair twisted into a low knot under a knit cap. Her eyes were sharp, unreadable, and old enough to have seen too much without becoming careless. She moved like someone who had once been underestimated and had spent years making people regret it. Behind her stood a broad-shouldered medic named Luis Ortega, younger, with kind eyes above a trimmed black beard and the calm hands of a man who had learned to bring order into panic without raising his voice. The third was a compact woman with cropped blonde hair and a scar at the corner of her mouth, Agent Nina Voss, who said nothing at all but seemed to inspect every weakness in the house within one sweep of her pale gray gaze. They entered fast, spoke little, and became motion. Luis was beside Daniel in seconds, checking vitals, replacing Sarah's makeshift bandage with practiced efficiency. Mara looked once at Sarah, then at the children, then around the room with its worn furniture and patched walls. Her expression did not soften, but something in it acknowledged the truth without decoration. "You and the children cannot stay here," she said. "They'll circle back." Sarah glanced toward the hallway, toward the rooms that held almost nothing, and yet were everything they had. "I know," she answered. The safe house sat on the quieter side of Amherst, hidden inside an ordinary duplex that looked so bland it might have been designed by secrecy itself. Warm air met them when they stepped inside, and Lily actually stopped in the doorway in amazement, staring at the uncracked windows and the lamp that did not flicker. Ethan, still suspicious of Mercy, checked the locks without being asked. Sarah watched him do it and had to look away for a moment. Daniel left with the medical team that night. Rex went too, though not before pausing beside Sarah long enough for his shoulder to brush her leg in a silent, deliberate gesture that felt almost like thanks. For 3 days, the world narrowed into waiting. Government people came and went. Forms were mentioned, then postponed. Food appeared in the refrigerator as if by domestic miracle. Lily slept deeply for the first time in months. Ethan did not. Sarah found herself pacing the kitchen at odd hours, remembering the weight of Daniel's wound under her hands and wondering why a stranger's survival had begun to matter so much. When Daniel returned on the 4th day, he looked less like a ghost and more like a man trying to pretend he had never been one. His arm was secured in a dark sling, and the sharp planes of his face had regained some color, though fatigue still lived around his eyes. Beside him, Rex was once again composed and watchful, his coat brushed clean, his dignity fully restored after the performance of household stupidity. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of the children, the borrowed safety, and Sarah near the counter in a plain gray sweater, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders for the first time. Without the emergency, she looked younger and more tired, beautiful only in the stubborn, unadvertised way of women who had carried too much for too long. "I came to say thank you," he said. Sarah crossed her arms, partly from habit, partly to keep herself from showing relief. "You already survived. That seems like a decent thank you." A quieter man might have left it there, but Daniel had the kind of perception forged by years of reading scenes people wanted hidden. He noticed the way Ethan flinched at sudden hallway sounds. He noticed Lily asking permission before touching anything that was clearly meant for children. He noticed Sarah standing as if invisible blows still might come from the side. "You were medical," he said, not asking. Sarah's face changed by 1 degree. "I used to be a nurse." "Used to?" She held his gaze a moment longer, then looked past him toward the winter light at the window. "I left my husband 6 months ago," she said. "He didn't like losing control. So I took the children and ran before he could teach them what fear was supposed to look like." Daniel was silent, but not with pity. Pity was soft and useless. What sat in his eyes was something steadier, more respectful. "You didn't run," he said. "You got them out." Sarah looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time since the road, she believed he saw her clearly. Not as a victim, not as a poor woman in borrowed shelter. As someone who had stood in the cold with shaking hands and chosen courage anyway. And somehow, that recognition felt more dangerous than the gunman had.
The arrests happened before sunrise, as if the night itself had finally grown tired of protecting wicked men. Sarah did not see the takedowns, only the aftermath that moved through the safe house in low voices, sealed folders, and the relieved tension of people who had spent too long holding themselves ready. Marakin arrived just after dawn, with snow melting on the shoulders of her dark coat, and a weariness around her eyes that only appeared when the danger had passed. In daylight, she looked less like a mystery and more like a woman who had built her life out of discipline. Tall, lean, bronze-skinned, with a face all clean angles and restraint, and hands that never fidgeted because she had spent years learning what nervousness cost. "They got them," she said simply. "The 2 from your porch, and 3 others before they could leave the county." Sarah sat very still at the small kitchen table, both hands around a mug of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Relief did not arrive like joy. It arrived like weakness, as if fear had finally loosened its claws and left bruises behind. Ethan, standing near the window out of habit more than need, looked over his shoulder. "So they can't come back?" he asked. Mara turned to him with a rare softness. "Not tonight," she said. It was an honest answer, and because it was honest, Sarah trusted it. What came next was less dramatic and somehow harder. Safety was not a miracle descending from heaven. It was paperwork, statements, signatures, legal forms, waiting rooms, and telling the truth more than once. Daniel Brooks gave his testimony from a hospital conference room, with his wounded shoulder strapped tight and exhaustion carved deep around his eyes. He looked stronger now, though strength on him had always been a quiet thing, buried in the straight line of his spine and the patience with which he spoke when everyone else was in a hurry. He was not a man who wasted charm, but he had the steadiness of someone who had learned early that panic helped no one. Years in uniform had sharpened him. Betrayal inside his own department had hardened him further. Yet, when he looked at Sarah across the room, there was never suspicion there, only the unmistakable recognition of one survivor noticing another. His testimony helped secure charges not only against the men who had chased him, but against officers and intermediaries tied to missing weapons and falsified evidence. The rot had roots, but roots could be pulled if enough hands stopped pretending the tree was healthy. For Sarah, the next battle waited in a quieter place. His name was Martin Miller, and even seeing it on legal documents made her stomach tighten. Martin had once been the sort of man people called reliable before they knew him well. Broad-shouldered, conventionally handsome, with light brown hair, always neatly cut, and a smile practiced enough to pass for sincerity in public. He worked warehouse shifts, paid bills on time when it suited him, and knew exactly how to wear decency like a coat. But in private, control had become the center of his personality. A layoff 3 years earlier had curdled something inside him. Humiliation turned mean, meanness turned violent, and soon every room in the house had learned the weather of his moods. Sarah had not left because she stopped loving easily. She had left because Ethan had begun to stand between them, and Lily had learned to go silent when doors shut too hard. Now, with federal protection behind her and a family advocate assigned through the task force, she went back only once to retrieve what was hers and end what should have ended long before. The advocate's name was Joanna Pike, a compact woman in her 50s with silver blonde hair cut at the jaw and the plain, durable face of someone who had spent decades telling frightened women the truth without decorating it. Joanna wore no perfume, no softness, no illusion that justice was elegant. She stood beside Sarah in that house like a steel post driven into the ground. Martin looked smaller when they entered, though he was not a small man. That was the first surprise. The second was how little Sarah feared him, with witnesses in the room, and her children nowhere near his shadow. She took her identification, the children's birth certificates, her nursing license, and the framed photograph of Ethan and Lily from the year before things had fully broken. When the divorce papers were placed before Martin, he signed with the resentful stiffness of a man discovering he was no longer the main force in the room. Sarah did not speak to him beyond what was necessary. Some endings did not deserve speeches. The hospital came later, and with it, a different kind of trembling. Buffalo General had once been part of the life Sarah thought she would have forever: bright hallways, clipped shoes on polished floors, charts, coffee gone cold, aching feet, useful exhaustion. Walking back into a hospital lobby after so many months felt like stepping toward a younger self she had failed. Daniel arranged the introduction, but did not hover, which was one of the reasons Sarah had come to trust him. He brought her to meet Eleanor Whitmore, the nurse manager of a medical surgical floor. Eleanor was in her early 60s, tall and straight-backed, with silver hair pinned into a no-nonsense twist and reading glasses hanging from a chain, like a warning to incompetence. Her expression suggested she had seen every kind of human foolishness and survived it by refusing to be impressed. Yet her voice, when she spoke to Sarah, carried the dry warmth of someone who believed skill mattered more than spotless history. "A license can go quiet," Eleanor said, scanning the reinstatement paperwork. "But hands remember." Sarah almost cried at that, which would have been embarrassing in front of such a woman. Instead, she sat a competency review, answered questions, and found that memory lived where hope had nearly died. Not all at once, not elegantly, but enough. Winter did not end overnight. Healing never did. Yet the shape of the days began to change. Ethan stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed, and then, one evening, forgot to check them at all. Lily stopped asking if angry men could find new houses, and instead asked whether nurses were allowed to wear bright socks to work. In the apartment provided through the relocation program, there was a narrow living room with a second-hand sofa, a lamp that leaned slightly left, and a gas fireplace that clicked before it warmed. Rex lay there one Sunday afternoon, stretched across the rug in absolute canine authority, older now not in years but in dignity, his muzzle resting on his paws, as if even he had decided enough vigilance had been paid to the gods of fear. Daniel sat in an armchair nearby, his sling gone, his shoulder healing, a file closed on the side table, because for once no one needed him to be useful in that exact minute. Sarah stood by the window with a cup of tea in both hands, watching snow fall softly over a street that did not know her old name for terror. She was still tall and slender, still dark-haired, still marked by loss in ways a mirror could not fully explain. But she was no longer bent inward. Behind her, Ethan laughed at something Lily said. Daniel smiled without interrupting. Rex thumped his tail once against the rug. Sarah turned from the window and looked at the room as if seeing a country she had nearly died before reaching. In the cruelest winter of her life, she had found something warmer than rescue. She had found the right to stand upright again, to believe in tomorrow without apologizing for it, and to understand that sometimes one act of courage in the dark was enough to lead an entire family back into the light.
In the end, this story is a reminder that miracles do not always arrive with thunder, fire, or parted seas. Sometimes, they come as a stranger on a frozen road, a door opened when fear says keep it shut, a hand that refuses to turn away, or the quiet strength God places inside an ordinary heart at exactly the right moment. Sarah thought she was simply helping a wounded man survive one terrible night, but perhaps heaven had already written a larger rescue, one that would save not only a life, but an entire family's future. That is often how God works in our daily lives. Not always by removing the storm at once, but by sending courage, help, and the right people before we lose hope completely. And maybe that is true for all of us. In everyday life, we meet people carrying hidden wounds, silent fears, and battles no one else can see. A kind word, a brave choice, a moment of compassion. These small things may look ordinary to us, but in God's hands, they can become the beginning of someone else's miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share where you are watching from and leave a comment below about a time when kindness, faith, or God's grace changed your life. And if you believe stories like this still matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so more people can find hope here. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and fill your life with peace. Wherever you are tonight, may the Lord walk beside you, carry what feels too heavy, and bring light into every dark place. Amen.